Okay, good afternoon. I'll be speaking on using FishBase and other online databases in teaching biodiversity. Okay, before I proceed, perhaps it's good if we're going to teach biodiversity in any level, whether it's for basic education to the graduate level, I think that the main goals would be knowledge about the diversity of the living world, defining what biodiversity is, and most importantly, recognizing what a species is and their ecological connections, which relates to a pressing issue called, which is biodiversity conservation. There are a lot of online resources on teaching biodiversity in the internet. We don't have the time really to talk about it, but I will focus more on the third one, which is recognizing what a species is, because that's an initial goal of teaching biodiversity. And traditionally, we get this from the primary information. This refers to museum and field collections information, including the labels, field notes, and species descriptions. In a lot of the older universities, there's always a university museum in which students of biodiversity can go and check on the material. Now, of course, the library would have taxonomic catalogs, and these are sources also of primary information, and also natural history guides. But natural history guides are not usually considered as primary sources, but rather as secondary sources. However, with the advent of increasing computing power, we can get much of this information from online databases, and also the spatial extent, especially if we have GIS. And so there has been a lot of information now available, and this, my slide's a little bit old, but there's even more information online about biodiversity information. And the databases have standards in which it's now much better to assess the completeness of the databases, although earlier it was said that databases couldn't contain all information. And of course, you can use your statistical routines to quantitatively evaluate the data. And so I don't need to go through this in detail. We know that there are a lot of biodiversity databases online, and FishBase and Sea Life Base, which I have used so much in the past, are very important in in teaching aquatic biodiversity and also in research. Now, one of the major objectives of biodiversity education is you bring your students to the field. That couldn't be taken out of the course objectives. But of course, before, this is how we do it. You collect it from the field and put it in the pail, bring it back to the lab and identify it. However, with conservation and environmental concerns, collecting has been actively discouraged. So we have to use more and more online resources, and we're going to collect only if that is in line with the research objectives in class. So, of course, you cannot really do away with collecting, but if you collect, you have to return it back into the water. Now, in places where there are good internet connection, you can easily verify the identification online, okay? But in a developing country context, this is a little bit difficult. Even here in the Philippines, in some place, internet connection is so slow. So that is a major hindrance to doing this kind of work, online work in the field. So in most cases, you really have to do the identification in the lab. So whether you're identifying fish parasites, as the students here are trying to do, or identifying invasive species that come in through the aquarium trade or through fisheries. And so one of the major learning objectives is to recognize species, and in an applied aspect, invasive species. So I have this example about the use of a biodiversity database a long time ago for, it's not an aquatic organism, but rather a moth that eats the invasive cactus in the Americas. But there is a need that the data should be of good quality. Now, most of the online databases have already more or less addressed that. That now it's indispensable to use an online database to really monitor invasive species, like what we've been doing in Manila Bay. So, I think some of you may be familiar with this slide, the GBIF network slide, in which what are the information that are in an online database. So the taxonomy and systematics of the species, and where is it found and when is it found, okay? And how that information is shared through the internet. And who gets to use it. And how do you validate the data, and how do students put their feedback, so if there are some errors in the entries in the database, it would get addressed. And of course, if we're looking at applied aspects like invasive species, proper georeferencing is important. And I think FishBase, I think, has gone a long way in addressing this problem. But before, with poor georeferencing, you might end up with species, like terrestrial species in the middle of the ocean. So anyway, what I discussed earlier are part of what we call biodiversity informatics, which online databases are really part of. So because I handle upper level undergraduate and postgraduate classes, so the biodiversity studies they have to do has to do something with the research question. So these research questions actually is dependent on two important data shortfalls in our knowledge of biodiversity, which biogeographers call as the Linnaean shortfall, or the lack of data on systematics and taxonomy, and the Wallacean shortfall, or the lack of data on distribution and its ecological correlates. So if we're going to understand the whole aspect of biodiversity, we should have enough data on systematics and taxonomy, and also on distribution and ecological correlates. So the online databases now have gone a long way in addressing those two shortfalls. But of course, it will always depend on the amount of data that's provided. And that's one of the important contributions of students, is to report new occurrences, especially in their field work, okay, which will enable us to have better understanding of, for instance, the effect of climate, changing climate scenarios on biodiversity, and again, on invasive species. So if we have enough data online, it's possible for us to make biodiversity maps. So here we modeled the biodiversity of coral reef ecosystems in the Philippines, with the ones in the darker shade being the more diverse per unit area region. So that's the Verde Island Passage, which I think most of us know is the center of the world's marine biodiversity. So this just supports that idea. But this is only possible if we can come up with good data sets and good georeferencing. So the last objective really is to make the connection. So what if you have the biodiversity data and your students understand it? They have to apply this knowledge to certain environmental problems. So for instance, if we want to start, I think this was mentioned earlier, the use of by the speaker who discussed the use of R package in predicting occurrence of marine species. A climate envelope, I think we did research on this, in which we have to predict at certain climate scenarios where the cockle or the anadara, or in the Filipino national language, it's called batotoy, okay, where will it be found if the temperature increases? So based on our modeling and the right identification of the species, we're able to determine that we hypothesize that this species is thermally adapted. So if where the climate gets warmer, the species probably will remain there, okay? Will persist. But of course, most species are not like that. So we can only do that if we have enough data, and online databases can actually make life easier for us to analyze the data. So this species is known to be thermally adapted. And also, the online databases are important if the student wants to pursue a career in conservation planning. For instance, delimiting or finding out where the conservation priority areas are. There is a big field of research on this, okay, which areas should be conserved. And again, we should have good data from online databases and good georeference data, most importantly, in order to come up with conservation prioritization. And there are a lot of algorithms, models that can be used with their different strengths, okay, and weaknesses. And we don't have the luxury of time to discuss all the models, but all the models, information on the models will be found in the internet. Several papers have been published on that. It's not just that only in conservation, also we use the online databases in order to look at the urban landscape of the UP Diliman campus. So one of the things that we did was to let the students document the distribution of biodiversity in an urban campus like UP Diliman and put that in a database for future work referenced by urban planners. So they would know which parts of the campus should have a degree of where development can be done and where the landscape should be maintained as a green area. Okay, so these are just some of the applications of online databases in learning. Okay? To summarize, it's really important that the student would know what biodiversity is and what's the unit of biodiversity, which is the species. So that's the first step to take. Then the strategies on linking it with environment, with the help of online databases, would then happen, and that would meet most of the learning objectives. So thank you very much, and good afternoon again.
Thank you, Dr. Vallejo, for that example on teaching biodiversity using online databases in FishBase and first plugging that FishBase has good data. Okay. The floor is now open for your questions.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. When I saw the map of areas that would warrant priority protection, it immediately came to mind that the identification of the area as such is certainly a very important step, but it doesn't achieve protection per se. We know that a lot of areas have been recently declared marine protected areas, but the actual enforcement of such protection is a major headache, and some exist only on paper. Is there anything in the teaching program that connects you to other areas of knowledge that make that connection between the biological and ecological knowledge and what you do with it in applying it to the real life pressures of making use of just about everything there is?
Yes, at the latter part of the term, we try to look at cases and get our colleagues from the social science and economics faculty to put their inputs on, because the a biodiversity course really can't cram everything in one semester, in one term. But we put special emphasis on putting the social and economic data. Because, for instance, if there's we can just model it mathematically, but of course the models won't have any meaning if the social dimension doesn't fit the social dimension of the problem. I think we made a case like that. I think for UP Diliman, when we tried to model it, we interviewed a lot of people, so we would know how they use the park-like environment of the campus. So some policies could be recommended to the chancellor.
Yes, please.
Yes, good afternoon. That's a very interesting report. No, I have two questions. UP is a government institute under by the government, right? Do you have any allocate budget for that database using online?
No, that has to be proposed as a research project.
Okay.
It's not really part of the. For instance, if we're going to continue with that, we have to write a grant proposal to the university, and if it gets funded, then we can. Because we had a small one for characterizing the Diliman campus, but that's very cheap. It's just about 150,000 pesos.
Yeah.
So it's not even enough. The students were actually slave labor. Okay. But if we're going to have a bigger grant, then we can answer more questions.
Okay. And number two, last question. Do you think biodiversity information can easily understand by Filipino, especially during the barrios, if you can disseminate that information?
Yeah, there are many strategies for doing that. One quick way is now in social media is to put infographics, but those infographics, I'm not an expert on infographics, but the infographics should be well designed. Okay, I had a student who's a visual communications major, and that's her thesis, communicating conservation ideas through infographics. Perhaps she would be in a better position to speak on that. Okay, but there are. One quick way is now through social media, as long as the strategies are well defined, the objectives are well defined, because not everything that's said through social media will reach the intended audience.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Vallejo, good afternoon po. You have stated, and it is a fact, that indeed FishBase and Sea Life bases are hosted in the Philippines, but you said that it has provided really vast info to the fishery sector. But with the premise that you have stated biodiversity data must be connected to the environment, are there some specific projects that are linked into this that you have been into, which you could cite as concrete examples?
Yeah, our research on invasive species on Manila Bay. One of the Finn staff, Jennifer Espedito, is my student. Okay, I'm her thesis advisor. Okay, so our research actually focuses on identifying species that come in possibly through ballast water. And quite recently, we have documented the entry of Mytilus, which is a species from the Mediterranean, in Manila Bay. And we were able to make a quick diagnosis because of sea life base. Okay, a quick identification. But of course, the definitive identification is when the DNA barcodes come in. So we sent it to Singapore for DNA barcoding, and we're still awaiting the final species identification, because the final species identification now is through DNA data. Okay, so if we did not have a sea life base, then it would have taken us a longer time to really say that there is an invasive species in in Manila Bay. Okay, so we're planning to write this up as a scientific paper within the next few months, okay, when the DNA identification comes in.
Okay, that's all the time we have for this session. Once again, thank you, Dr. Vallejo, and thank you for your questions.